The more you try to escape the pain, the more it seeps into every part of your life. Grief, when ignored, has a way of making everything around you feel darker, heavier, suffocating. You know this. You've seen it before, maybe in yourself or maybe in someone you care about. Maybe it's that constant ache of having lost someone close to you, or the hollow feeling after life throws a cruel twist your way. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one talks about. Grief doesn't go away. You don't outrun it, and you don't get over it. What you can do, however, is transform it. What if that same grief, that feels like a crushing weight, could instead be turned into something powerful? Something that builds a legacy, something that creates meaning out of chaos. Today, we're diving into the stories of three incredible historical figures who turned their deepest losses into something far greater than themselves. These leaders didn't just survive their grief. They turned it into the fuel for building empires, changing the world in ways that continue to inspire us centuries later. Their stories, those of Genghis Khan, Cyrus the Great, and Hatshepsut, aren't just tales of overcoming adversity. They are blueprints for how you can take your own pain and transform it into your life's greatest strength. When you think of Genghis Khan, the image that comes to mind is probably one of brutal conquest and vast empire building. But that's not how his story begins. It starts with a boy named Temujin, no more than a teenager, left to fend for his family after his father is murdered. Picture this: a young boy, barely a man, abandoned by his own clan, and left to die. His family was starving, outcast, and alone, shivering in the bitter Mongolian winds, with nothing but their wits and each other to rely on. Imagine what that would do to someone's psyche. Your father taken from you, your entire world crumbling, and everyone you thought you could trust turning their backs. In that moment, Genghis Khan could have crumbled under the weight of grief and abandonment. Many of us would have. Losing your father at such a young age, especially in a society where clan loyalty meant survival, would have been devastating. But instead of letting that grief consume him, Genghis used it as fuel to forge something bigger. He could have chosen revenge against those who betrayed him, but he looked beyond the immediate and focused on a vision that would surpass personal vendettas. His father's death ignited in him a fire that drove him to unite the Mongol tribes, previously fractured and at each other's throats, into one of the most powerful forces the world had ever seen. Think about it. A young boy, orphaned, shunned, and cast out, takes that crushing weight of loss and builds something the world has never seen. That's the power of grief transformed. It was the hurt of losing his father, the isolation of abandonment, and the betrayal of his clan that propelled Genghis Khan to break the cycle of clan warfare and create a new world order. His legacy wasn't built out of blind rage. It was born from a deeper purpose, one that transcended the immediate pain. His loss made him relentless, yes, but it also gave him the vision to think beyond his personal suffering. He redefined loyalty, built alliances, and ultimately created the largest contiguous empire in history. Now ask yourself, what do you do when life rips away something fundamental? Do you let the grief turn inward, gnawing at you from the inside? Or do you take that grief and use it to build something bigger than yourself? You're born into royalty, but you don't even know it. Instead, you're raised in the wilderness by shepherds, unaware that you're meant to inherit a throne. Sounds like the plot of an epic tale, right? But that was the real-life story of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. According to legend, Cyrus was taken from his royal parents as an infant and given to a shepherd family to raise, all because of a prophecy that he would one day overthrow his grandfather, the king. Imagine growing up, feeling like you don't quite belong, always sensing there's something more out there for you, but not knowing what it is. Then, one day, you discover your true identity, that you're not just some ordinary kid, but the heir to a kingdom. How do you even process that? For Cyrus, this revelation didn't lead to bitterness over being cast aside. Instead, it sparked the beginning of one of the greatest legacies in history. Raised by shepherds, he knew what it was like to live a simple, grounded life, And that upbringing would later influence his leadership style in ways that set him apart from other rulers of his time. Cyrus didn't let the abandonment define him. He didn't wallow in the fact that he had been separated from his parents. Instead, he took the best of both worlds, his royal blood and his humble upbringing, and used them to create an empire that was as innovative as it was vast. He is often remembered for his relatively humane policies, for creating a legal structure that promoted religious tolerance, and for drafting what many consider to be one of the first declarations of human rights, the Cyrus Cylinder. Let's break this down. Cyrus had every reason to become bitter, to use his abandonment as an excuse for why he couldn't achieve greatness. But instead, he saw the big picture. He understood that his loss wasn't a limitation. It was the key to his purpose. Without the hardships of his youth, could he have led with such compassion and fairness? Probably not. His time in the wilderness, disconnected from the palace, shaped him into a ruler who could see beyond the politics of the court and understand the needs of the common people. When life strips something from you, whether it's a person, an opportunity, or a dream, you have two choices. You can let that loss hollow you out, or you can let it carve out space for something greater. Now imagine ruling an empire in a world that tells you you're not supposed to be in charge. You're a woman in ancient Egypt, expected to quietly step aside once your stepson is old enough to take the throne. But instead of retreating into the shadows, you step forward, crown yourself pharaoh, and rule for over 20 years. That was Hatshepsut's story, one marked by personal loss and extraordinary resilience. When Hatshepsut's husband, who was also her half-brother, died, she was left in a precarious position. She could have easily succumbed to grief, stepped aside, and allowed her young stepson to take the reins, while she faded into the background, as so many women of her time were expected to do. But that's not what she did. Instead, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, a move unheard of for a woman at the time, and ruled Egypt with strength, intelligence, and foresight. Losing her husband didn't break her. It made her stronger. It was her loss that forced her to step into her own power and claim her place in history. Under her reign, Egypt flourished. She launched ambitious building projects, including her famous mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, and expanded trade routes, bringing wealth and stability to her people. Her grief didn't lead her to crumble. It became the foundation upon which she built a legacy. Think about that for a second. Hatshepsut wasn't just dealing with personal loss. She was up against a society that didn't think she had any right to lead. Her stepson's advisors were probably whispering in the shadows, waiting for her to make a mistake so they could push her aside. But instead of being consumed by grief or fear, Hatshepsut transformed her loss into action, into purpose. She didn't shy away from the pain. She channeled it into creating something lasting, something greater than herself. How often do we let the weight of our losses keep us from stepping into our full potential? Hatshepsut's story teaches us that loss can either bury you, or it can become the solid ground you stand on to rise. If there's one thread that ties together these historical figures, it's this. They didn't ignore their losses. They didn't bury their grief under distractions or pretend it didn't hurt. They faced it head-on and let it shape them into the leaders they became. What happens when you don't do that? History is full of examples of rulers who let their grief consume them, who spiraled into paranoia or isolation because they refused to confront their pain. The warning signs are all there. Physical exhaustion, mental withdrawal, strained relationships, and a creeping sense of purposelessness. These aren't just things that happen to rulers in history books. They're things that happen to all of us when we refuse to deal with our losses, when we try to keep pushing forward without acknowledging the grief weighing us down. Genghis Khan, Cyrus the Great, and Hatshepsut all show us that loss is inevitable. But the difference between those who collapse under it and those who rise from it is how they confront it. They didn't let their pain define them. They let it drive them. The stories of Genghis Khan, Cyrus the Great, and Hatshepsut aren't just distant historical anecdotes. They're blueprints for how each of us can confront the grief and loss in our own lives. These figures didn't allow their pain to become a prison, trapping them in despair. Instead, they turned their losses into fuel, using it to build something far greater than themselves. The key takeaway here is simple. Loss will happen. It's an inevitable part of life, whether it's the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or the collapse of a long-held dream. But what you do with that loss, how you choose to respond to it, is entirely up to you. You can let it consume you, or you can let it transform you. There's no shame in feeling the weight of grief. It's a part of being human. But the greatest leaders, the ones we still talk about thousands of years later, didn't just feel their pain, they used it. They understood that grief could be the very thing that gives you the strength to rise, to rebuild, and to leave a lasting impact. And just like them, you have that power within you. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you let your grief break you, or will you let it be the foundation for your legacy? Just as Genghis Khan united the tribes, Cyrus built an empire, and Hatshepsut redefined power, so too can you take your losses and create something that lasts beyond the pain. So today, start thinking about how you can turn your grief into purpose. Don't run from it. Don't hide it. Let it shape you, let it guide you, and ultimately, let it propel you into something greater than you ever imagined.